Excuse me. I'm sorry. I'll be right with you. I promise. I must say, you really put yourself in a difficult position. You may be an ambassador to England or France or even the King of England himself, but that doesn't mean that to whom much is given, much isn't still expected. You can't shirk your responsibilities. As your mother, Queen Eleanor, has already said, your strong possession, much more than your right, has given you the English throne, especially against your sister-in-law Constance's claim for her son Arthur. Do you realize that he may be somebody's heir, namely your older brother Geoffrey's? You may be rich or poor, depending upon what the monasteries give you, but if you think you're going to be able to harm that child, you're going to face the wrath of your lords. Now, Cardinal Pandolf was sent directly by Pope Innocent III because you overextended your kingly power to name your own Archbishop of Canterbury. Cardinal Pandolf may be preaching spiritual pride, but even if you don't fear being excommunicated, this is going to jeopardize your relationship with King Philip and France. Sure, right now you might be living in a mansion, but if you lose the support of your nobles and your subjects, you might very well find yourself living in another country under another name, and that's if you're lucky enough to escape being poisoned by a member of the clergy. So just remember this while you're sleeping in a king-size bed. I know what you have in mind with Hubert, but Arthur is your nephew, and he has as strong a claim to the English throne as you do. And sure, you may call me a Budinsky, you may call me a negative Nelly, you may call me anything, but no matter what you say, even if you're king, I tell thee, your majesty, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're still going to have to serve somebody. If there's one constant theme that runs through all of Shakespeare's history plays, it's that the lead characters spend most of their time seeking power, abusing power, trying to hold on to their power, or losing power. So let's take a look at the plot of the life and death of King John. King John is visited by an ambassador from France who demands under threat of war that he renounce his throne in favor of his nephew, Arthur, who the French King Philip believes is the rightful heir to the English throne. King John oversees an inheritance dispute between Robert Falconbridge and his older brother Philip, whom Robert accuses of being illegitimate. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, King John's mother, notes that Philip looks very similar to her late son, King Richard the Lionheart, also known as Coeur de Lion. Thus, Queen Eleanor suggests that Philip renounce his claim to the Falconbridge estate in exchange for a non-inheriting position within the House of Plantagenet and a knighthood. King John dubs Philip Sir Richard Plantagenet. After Philip renounces his inheritance, his mother, Lady Falconbridge, reluctantly admits Coeur de Lion is his real father, saying, "By long and vehement suit, I was seduced to make room for him in my husband's bed." Meanwhile, in France, King Philip and his forces besiege the walled city of Angers and threaten to sack the city unless the citizens accept Prince Arthur as their king. Philip is supported by the Duke of Austria, who allegedly killed Richard the Lionheart. The English army arrives in France, and Queen Eleanor trades insults with Constance, Arthur's mother. King Philip and King John argue their claims in front of the Angers citizens, but to no avail. The city spokesperson says that they will only support the rightful king, whoever that turns out to be. After the French and English armies clash, each army sends a herald claiming victory, but the Angers citizens remain unconvinced because neither army has proven to be the clear victor. Philip, now called Sir Richard Plantagenet, suggests that the armies of England and France unite against Angiers, but the citizens propose an alternative, that King Philip's son Louis marry King John's niece Blanche of Castile. This would give King John a stronger claim to the English throne, while Louis the Dauphin would gain additional territories for France. A furious Constance denounces King Philip for abandoning the claims for her son Prince Arthur, and Louis and Blanche marry. Unfortunately, Cardinal Pandolf arrives from Pope Innocent III, bearing a formal accusation against King John, who blocked the Pope's chosen Archbishop of Canterbury, and extended his political power to include religious power. King John defies the jurisdiction of the Pope, and Cardinal Pandolf excommunicates King John. Pandolf demands that the French king renounce their newly formed treaty with England, but King Philip is hesitant, having just established familial ties to King John. Cardinal Pandolf says that Philip's ties to the Vatican are older and stronger, and reluctantly, Philip breaks ties with King John. As battles break out, the Duke of Austria is slain and beheaded by Sir Richard, and Prince Arthur is captured by the English army. Queen Eleanor is left in charge in France, while Sir Richard Plantagenet is sent to extort funds from the English monasteries. Meanwhile, King John secretly orders his subject Hubert to kill Arthur. Pandolf informs Louis the Dauphin that he now has as strong a claim to the English throne as Arthur or John, and Louis agrees to invade England. Hubert is reluctant to blind and kill Arthur and spares his life, but he doesn't want King John to know that he disobeyed his orders. The English lords demand Prince Arthur's release. King John agrees, but Hubert tells him that Arthur is dead. The nobles, believing the prince was murdered by his own uncle, defect to Louis the Dauphin and France. At the same time, King John learns that his mother and Lady Constance have died. Sir Richard reports that the monasteries are unhappy about the king's attempt to steal their lands and gold. Hubert is furious with King John, who pretends that he really didn't mean to order Arthur killed. But after King John fears retaliation for Arthur's murder, Hubert tells the king that Arthur is still alive. King John is delighted and sends him to tell this news to the nobles. Unfortunately, Arthur attempts to escape and dies jumping off the castle wall. The nobles find his body and believe that he was murdered by King John, despite Hubert's entreaties that he left the boy well. A defeated King John surrenders his crown to Cardinal Pandolf, who reverses the king's excommunication and gives back the crown. King John orders Richard Plantagenet, one of his few remaining loyal subjects, to lead the English army against the invading forces of France. While the English nobility swears allegiance to Louis the Dauphin in France, Cardinal Pandolf arrives and explains that King John has renounced his claims of supreme authority over the English Church, but Louis is adamant about continuing his invasion anyway and seizing the crown of England for himself. Richard Plantagenet arrives with the English army and threatens Louis, but to no avail. War breaks out and the losses mount up on each side, but Louis's reinforcements are wrecked and drowned during the sea crossing. The English nobles return to King John's side after a dying French nobleman, Count Melun, warns them that the Dauphin plans to behead them after his victory. King John is poisoned by a monk, and the lords gather round him as he dies. Richard Plantagenet plans a second assault on Louis's forces, but he learns that Cardinal Pandolf has negotiated a peace treaty. Richard Plantagenet and the English nobility all swear allegiance to John's son, Prince Henry. When we get back, we'll look at some of the interesting characters in King John. All right, let's take a look at some of these colorful and interesting characters in King John. We'll start with King John himself. He is the King of England, whose claim to the throne is now being challenged. Then we have his mother, Queen Eleanor. She's also his trusted and wise advisor. The next up is Philip Falconbridge. He's believed to be the firstborn son of Lady Falconbridge and the late Sir Robert Falconbridge, but is actually the illegitimate son of the late King Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart, or in French, Coeur de Lion. He later renounces his name and is knighted Sir Richard Plantagenet. Lady Falconbridge is the wife of late old Sir Robert Falconbridge and the mother of Philip and Robert Falconbridge. She was seduced by the late King Richard and fathered her firstborn son Philip, as we learn. Lady Constance is the widow of Geoffrey, eldest brother to King John and mother of Prince Arthur, whom she believes is the rightful heir to the English throne. Arthur is the young son of late Geoffrey and Constance, who may well be the rightful heir to the English throne. He also holds the title of Duke of Bretagne, and although he's just a boy, his uncle King John sees him as a threat. Next up would be Hubert. He's a follower of King John, whom the king asked to kill young Prince Arthur. Then we have the Earls of Essex, Pembroke, and Salisbury. They're often referred to as the Lords, who are attendees of King John, and their role is to advise him and to also keep him in check. King Philip is King of France, who claims that young Arthur is the true heir to the English throne. We also have Lady Blanche of Spain. She's the niece of King John of England, who marries Louis the Dolphin of France to create a peace between England and France. Louis the Dolphin is the son of King Philip, who agrees to marry Lady Blanche. Cardinal Pandolf of Milan is the antagonist in the play. He's a legate from Pope Innocent III of Rome, who throws a monkey wrench into the newly knitted peace between England and France. And finally, we have Count Melon. He's a follower of King Philip of France, who tells the lords of the Dauphin's plans to betray and behead them. When we get back, we'll take a look at some of the plot devices and memorable scenes that make King John so memorable. Let's take a look at some of King John's best plot devices and memorable scenes. Illegitimacy is one of the more common plot devices in Shakespeare's plays, especially in the history plays. It makes sense because it serves to create confusion and conflict in the pursuit of power and the crown. It also blurs the lines of succession and legitimate rights. We'll see it again in King Lear between Gloucester's legitimate son Edgar and his illegitimate son Edmund, who's a villain. In Much Ado About Nothing, there is the legitimate Don Pedro and his illegitimate brother Don John, who is also a villain. In Troilus of Cressida, we'll meet the illegitimate Thersites, a scurrilous and low-class fool who acts as the play's commentator. Shakespeare also uses the possibility of illegitimacy to allow characters like Richard III to rise to the throne and Henry VIII to trade in Catherine of Aragon for Anne Boleyn. One of the most memorable scenes in King John is Act 1, Scene 1. King John must decide between Philip and Robert Falconbridge who is the rightful heir. Philip decides to give up all of his claims to his father's lands, give them to his brother, and instead follows King John and Queen Eleanor as Sir Richard Plantagenet. This is a case of him deciding to succeed or fail based on his own merits and not on an inheritance. By the way, Shakespeare uses Sir Richard as the play's commentator. Another memorable scene is in Act 3, Scene 1, right after the wedding of Lady Blanche to Louis the Dauphin of France. Cardinal Pandolf arrives as the legate from the Pope to excommunicate King John for usurping his authority over papal responsibilities. Cardinal Pandolf threatens to do the same thing to King Philip of France unless he breaks off his ties with King John. King Philip, fearing being excommunicated, agrees to sever ties, and the two countries once again prepare for war against each other. Unfortunately, King John of England is Lady Blanche's uncle, and Louis the Dauphin of France is now her husband. As we will see, this puts Lady Blanche in a most awkward predicament. This is a similar situation to the one Octavia found herself in Antony and Cleopatra. She was married to Mark Antony, and her brother was Octavius Caesar. Like Octavia, Blanche was used to broker a peace between warring factions, and in both cases, even after the marriages, war broke out again between the warring combatants. Let's take a look at some of the strong motivations that run through King John. Let's look at power and responsibility. This play revolves around power. Who should have it? How far should it extend? And living with the consequences of it. First, we have King John. His claim to the throne is questionable because his older brother Geoffrey's son, Arthur Bretagne, also has a strong claim. At first, John is willing to give Arthur the town of Angiers in France. This is more to satisfy Prince Arthur's mother, Constance, than anything. But later, he gives instructions to Hubert to have Arthur killed. And even though Hubert doesn't kill Arthur, he still dies from falling off a castle wall while he's trying to escape. This creates a ripple effect because the lords are outraged and believe the king was behind Arthur's death, so they defect to France. After this happens, King John learns that his mother, Queen Eleanor, has died, and he's been excommunicated, leaving him vulnerable as a monarch. He eventually gets Cardinal Pandolf to reinstate him, but by this time he's become weak and ineffective as a ruler, and he must use his nephew Richard Plantagenet as the surrogate leader for the English army. In his weakness, King John is poisoned by a monk and dies just before the end of the play. Cardinal Pandolf also has great responsibility bestowed upon him by the Pope. The problem is that he doesn't consider the consequences for his actions. While it's true that King John overstepped his authority by installing his own Archbishop of Canterbury counter to the Pope's intentions, Cardinal Pandolf doesn't take any responsibility for the havoc he wreaks by excommunicating King John at the wedding ceremony of Lady Blanche and Louis, creating massive war and loss of life. With the leverage of King Philip on his side, plus the newly wedded Blanche, who was King John's niece, it's much more likely that King John would have agreed to reasonable terms had the cardinal not been so hard-headed at the wedding reception. In summary, King John failed because, even as a monarch, he didn't recognize that he still had an obligation to serve the Pope in religious matters, and Cardinal Pandolf took no responsibility for the consequences caused by the power entrusted in him by the Pope, which just goes to show that to whom much is given, much is expected. Let's cover two more strong motivations in King John: honor and betrayal. Richard Falconbridge is loyal to King John and Queen Eleanor, whom he rescues from the French. They befriend him, and he takes his responsibility seriously, and even though Arthur is King John's foe, he warns Hubert if he had anything to do with Arthur's death. Listen to his words. "Here's a good world. Knew you of this fair work? Beyond the infinite and boundless reach of mercy, if thou didst this deed of death, art thou damned, Hubert. Ha! I tell thee what, thou art damned as black, nay, nothing is so black. Thou art more deep damned than Prince Lucifer. There is not yet so ugly a fiend of hell as thou shalt be if thou didst kill this child. If thou didst but consent to this most cruel act, do but despair, and if thou want'st a cord, the smallest thread that ever spider twisted from her womb will serve to strangle thee. A rush will be a beam to hang thee on. Or wouldst thou drown thyself? Put a little water in a spoon, and it shall be, as all the ocean, enough to stifle up such a villain." Richard Falconbridge remains loyal to King John until his death, and immediately swears allegiance to his son Prince John. But the Dauphin has no trouble betraying the English lords and turns his back on Cardinal Pandolf, who originally urged him on. The Count Melon feels compelled to save the English lords, whom he had already betrayed, once he is fatally wounded. He does this for redemption, honor, love of Hubert, and because his grandfather was an Englishman. When we come back, we'll look at some of Shakespeare's most powerful lines in King John. There's some great speeches in King John, so let's look at some of Shakespeare's most powerful lines. Blanche's plea to the English and French armies is worth reviewing because she's caught in the middle of a miserable situation. In Act 3, Scene 1, she says, "The sun's o'ercast with blood, fair day adieu. Which is the side that I must go withal? I am with both. Each army hath a hand, and in their rage, I having hold of both, they whirl asunder and dismember me. Husband, I cannot pray that thou mayst win. Uncle, I needs must pray that thou mayst lose. Father, I may not wish the fortune thine. Grandam, I will not wish thy wishes thrive. Whoever wins, on that side shall I lose, assured loss before the match be played." As a result of this situation, Blanche becomes one of Shakespeare's most sympathetic female characters. And we'll finish up with Sir Richard Plantagenet's ending words in Act 5, Scene 7. This is at the close of the play, right after King John's death and the pending elevation of Prince Henry to King Henry III. "O let us pay the time but needful woe, since it hath been beforehand with our griefs. This England never did, nor never shall, lie at the proud foot of a conqueror, but when it first did help to wound itself. Now these her princes are come home again, come the three corners of the world in arms, and we shall shock them. Naught shall make us rue, if England to itself do rest but true." This speech allows us to see the true nature of this noble character. When we return, we'll look at some of the major turning points and correlations in King John. All right, now let's take a look at some of the major turning points and correlations in King John. The first one takes place in Act 3, Scene 2. Arthur tries to escape the castle and jumps to his death. This casts suspicion on both King John and Hubert, even though they didn't kill Arthur, and it causes the lords to defect and support France. The next one is Act 3, Scene 4. Cardinal Pandolf urges on the Dauphin to claim England for his own through the right of his wife, Blanche. Here we see that the cardinal is a troublemaker and that he's learned how to manipulate people to get what he wants. We'll also see a similar scenario in Henry VIII between Cardinal Wolsey and the king, both of whom abuse their powers in the play. And finally, in Act 5, Scene 4, the fatally wounded Count Melon tells the lords that they have been bought and sold and that they should return to King John before the Dauphin, if he's victorious, can have them beheaded. In King Lear, the fatally wounded villain Edgar tries to make things right by confessing his crimes to his brother Edmund and to the Duke of Albany. In Cymbeline, the evil queen on her deathbed admits to trying to kill her husband and his daughter. And at the end of Hamlet, Laertes begs forgiveness of Hamlet, saying that both of them have been poisoned and that King Claudius is to blame. When we get back, we'll look at some interesting facts about King John. In doing some research for this video, I found some interesting facts about the real King John. He was the youngest of 5 legitimate sons of Henry Plantagenet. He was given the nickname John Lackland by his father Henry II because he thought it unlikely that he would ever inherit any property. Although he reigned for 17 years, he was such an unpopular leader that his subjects called him Bad King John. His brother was Richard the Lionheart, but the two of them did not get along very well. John even tried to have Richard's captors imprison him and hold him longer, but they refused. However, Richard forgave his brother because he felt he had been given evil counsel. King John was accused of trying to rape Lord Essex Fitzwalter's daughter, Matilda. Fitzwalter later led a group of barons to force King John to sign the Magna Carta, which would limit the king's powers. King John reneged on his original support of the Magna Carta, resulting in the British Civil War known as the First Barons' War. In real life, he died of dysentery during the Civil War and not on the battlefield, making a fitting ending to his unremarkable life. All right, now let's go through the actors that appear in the 1984 BBC Shakespeare version of the life and death of King John. First, Leonard Rossiter, who plays King John himself, sadly died that very same year, ironically while he was waiting to go and perform on stage. Mary Morris, who plays Queen Eleanor, also plays the Duchess of Gloucester in the 1979 BBC Shakespeare version of Richard II. Robert Brown, who plays the Earl of Pembroke, also played Sir Walter Blunt in the 1979 BBC Shakespeare version of Henry IV Part 1. William Whymper, who plays Sir Tilion, also plays Sir Stephen Stroop in the 1979 BBC Shakespeare version of Richard II. Clara Bloom, one of my favorite actresses, plays Lady Constance, also played Gertrude in the 1980 BBC version of Hamlet opposite Derek Jacobi, the Queen in the 1982 BBC version of Cymbeline opposite Helen Mirren, and Catherine of Aragon in the 1979 BBC Shakespeare version of Henry VIII. Phillida Law, who plays Lady Falconbridge, will also play Ursula in the 1993 version of Kenneth Branagh's Much Ado About Nothing, opposite Kate Beckinsale, and her real-life daughter, Emma Thompson. She also appears with her other daughter, Sophie Thompson, in the wonderful non-speaking role of the hard-of-hearing Mrs. Bates in the 1996 version of Emma, starring Gwyneth Paltrow. Charles Kay, who plays King Philip of France, also plays the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1989 Kenneth Branagh version of Henry V. And finally, Gordon Kay, no relation, who plays the Duke of Austria, also plays the First Watch in the 1984 BBC Shakespeare version of Much Ado About Nothing. When we get back, it's time for this week's trivia challenge. It's called Three of a Kind. All right, now it's time for today's trivia challenge, and the category is called Three of a Kind. So name the common bond for each of these three related clues and the plays in which they appear. Number 1, Regan, Goneril, and Cordelia. Number 2, Oliver, Jaques, and Orlando. And number 3, gold, silver, and base lead. Let's see how you do. Come back in just a moment, and I'll have all the answers for you. All right, so let's see how you did with today's trivia challenge, Three of a Kind. You were to name the common bond for each of these three related clues and the play in which they appear. Let's go through them together. Number 1, Regan, Goneril, and Cordelia. Of course, those are the three daughters of King Lear. Number 2, Oliver, Jaques, and Orlando. They are the three sons of Sir Roland de Boys in As You Like It. And the third one, gold, silver, and base lead. They are the three caskets of Portia in The Merchant of Venice. Now, let's finish up with some relevant lessons for today. First, like Philip Falconbridge demonstrates, it doesn't matter where you start, but rather where you finish that counts. He didn't allow his illegitimacy to hold him back. In fact, he embraced it, and he forced people to interact with him based on his skills and his courage. Everything he eventually got, he got by earning it, including his knighthood. Number 2, Hubert refused to go through with his king's directive to kill young Arthur. Even though he originally said he would do it, he reached the right conclusion and spared the child's life. Not all decisions in life are easy, but you'll be most remembered for how you handle the most difficult ones, especially on Judgment Day. And finally, what's right is more important than who's right. Cardinal Pandolf abused his power by making it his personal mission to create as much havoc as possible to get his own way. He easily could have gotten King John to work with him, as we see in Act 5, Scene 1. Just remember that you can accomplish more through rapport building, tact, and diplomacy than you can with threats and ultimatums. I'm Dave Romeo, and thank you for watching this episode of Romeo on Shakespeare. Please join me next time when you will hear a tale so bloody and so heinous that you will long for tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow.